And so my general interpretation is depression is connected to a dysfunctional Mars. Mars has to do with anger, taking initiative. On my website, I do the Mars signs that come up, and I always say Mars shows what makes us angry while it's in the cycle, and you know, how we respond to anger. Mars, I believe, has just gone into Cancer, so anger is going to be more emotional, and people have to kind of act on those feelings, talking about it, getting that energy out. Otherwise, it can make you kind of depressed. So uh, when anger or energies become inverted, depression is the result. So I called it depression is connected with an acute Mars dysfunction combined with, I'll say, Saturn afflictions that undermine self-confidence and self-esteem. So depression occurs when we do not give ourselves permission to feel angry. And this often occurs because we feel we don't have the right to be angry. We're afraid to be angry, and that often occurs when the life was filled with a lot of angry adults, and so the individual learned to shut down rather than get angry and jump in the fray. Fear of anger arises when you feel you've never scored a victory with your anger or assertiveness, and sometimes that has to do with the Mars-Neptune aspect. Or sometimes when our childhood is so filled with angry adults that we're afraid to show our anger for fear of retaliation, or sometimes even losing control in anger. So this kind of attitude, not dealing with our Mars, will make us feel powerless, and then it can make us feel hopeless. And depression seems to be the safe feeling substitute. Um, because depression sometimes is deemed it's okay or more acceptable than to get angry or act in a very angry response that could have engender a negative response on the part of other, or draw us into a conflict that we feel we really couldn't handle. Um, so the therapists that I consulted with say that it takes a lot of energy to be really that depressed. And the higher the energy level, the greater the depression. Now, one of the things sometimes I see, and I'm not talking about sun signs, sometimes if the person has a lot of Libra, Gemini in the chart, and nothing really in the 8th or 12th houses, they can develop a type of what I call superficiality. That is really a coping mechanism by which they never feel depressed, they don't feel angry, and sometimes they don't feel anything. You know, everything's great. You know, they maintain an equilibrium where they don't feel angry, they don't feel depressed, but that's kind of a coping mechanism. And I'm going to relate that more to Jupiter. Jupiter is really, I always recommend this book. It's written down here, Your Inner Child of the Past by Hugh Messeldine. It was written back in the 70s. And I say it's the best analysis of the moon aspects in a chart, even though it's not astrological, it's purely psychological. And what I learned from about Jupiter has to do with playing a role. Everything's great, everything's wonderful. And Jupiter can get very caught up in, like there could be a family pattern of not expressing your true feelings, especially if they're negative. And so I call this emotional role playing. And it's a type of people-pleasing behavior where everything's great, everything's wonderful, everything's just fine. For example, if you have a moon Jupiter hard aspect, then you had a mother who did not want to hear that you were unhappy. Everything's great, everything's wonderful, and sometimes you were rewarded with things, give you a cookie, give you a toy, give you permission. And so when a parent, and it's usually the mother, cannot deal with unhappy feelings, then no one else can express unhappiness. So the role playing begins in order to win approval. And when unhappy feelings start to surface, when we don't get our way, which is the payoff for playing a role, when we fear that approval will be withdrawn, it's easier to become depressed. I associate Jupiter with the fear of abandonment. I remember there was a psychologist in Baltimore. She just folded her hands and just couldn't believe Jupiter had to do with abandonment issues. But the psychological pattern is, if I do not play the role that others expect of me, When I do not live up to the expectations of others, they're going to withdraw their approval. And so this can be an issue that sometimes can lead to other types of substitutions, addictions, doing things we don't often relate to, and that can lead to a depression. And so I observed that the Mars sign is kind of the behavior around what makes us depressed. The house position is how and where that energy can be directed or channeled. And afflictions to Mars can either cause blocks or disruptions to the energy of Mars. And I'll have the Mars aspects listed down here later on. Um, so it is not so much that anger is the antidote to depression, but it's Mars's ability to assert oneself, to express your feelings in any situation that provides the solution and the resolution. Um, uh, well, I'm not going to go into what some other people say, but let's talk about some of the afflictions to Mars. Now, one of the things, I teach medical astrology for the International Academy of Astrology. And one of the things I talk about is certain rulerships. And one of the things I've observed is that uh, the rulership of an organ may not have anything to do with what causes a disease or a health issue around that organ. It's sometimes it's aspects or other things that suppress the use of that organ. And what I'm going to say is a dysfunctional Mars can impact the thyroid because you feel you cannot express your will, that you cannot give voice to your thoughts and your feelings. And I know when I studied Alice Bailey, she said that Saturn rules the throat chakra. And I found that Saturn is a repressor. And as a result, it can impact on the thyroid. Sometimes that Taurus Scorpio axis can be very sensitive to subtle vibrations. But also, if the energy is internalized, it can affect the thyroid. And I'm going to talk about this after I do the signs about hypothyroidism as it's connected with depression.